All right, we are recording. My computer doesn't want to do anything right now. There we go. Computer's ready for the weekend. All right. Cool. So, Zoomies, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Excuse me. So today is the last day you're going to have to listen to my loud mouth in front of the class here. On next Tuesday is when we have Marlon coming to give us a talk about and his experiences with what we're covering today, what we covered last time, and just some general experience in the startup versus big tech world. And then next Thursday, we're doing a final exam review. So if you have questions, go ahead and bring those. And we're doing that then, despite the fact that we're going to have presentations that next week that we come back from Thanksgiving, because I want to be able to get in a final exam review, but it would be a little disjointed and it would be unfair to those who would have to present before Thanksgiving compared to after Thanksgiving. So both those days will be completely virtual, no in-person component. Both days for the presentation, as well as both days for next week. If you have questions about that, let me know. But let's go ahead and get started. So what did we learn last time?
We learned that feedback and autonomy are the most important factors for job satisfaction.
Yeah, exactly. So without feedback or without a feeling of autonomy, an individual's job satisfaction, or actually motivation, diminishes to close to zero, right? It doesn't matter how much you can see the purpose of your work. If you feel like you're not getting adequate feedback or you're not having appropriate autonomy, it doesn't feel like you have much motivation. What else did we learn?
We also talked about how the Myers-Briggs really isn't a good test for that. So
Yes.
that actually probably training on the job may be the best representation of actually how they would be.
Yeah, it could be training on the job. I mean, there are other selection criteria that are good, right? So the Big Five has appropriate psychometrics such that in certain job fields, it could be appropriate to include. But the Myers-Briggs has such poor psychometrics. And when I say psychometrics, I mean, it doesn't really map onto anything concrete. It doesn't seem to. And so, you know, when we talk about things like psychometrics, we expect that personality is fixed over time, right? That's kind of definitionally what personality is. And if you have something that moves around a lot, like Myers-Briggs, you would say, okay, well, it's clearly not measuring personality if personality as a construct is fairly fixed. So, yes, give me one other thing that we learned last time. Using rock curves for personnel selection, exactly, yes. So we can chart our selection. So selection and truth into a signal detection framework, right? So we selected them 1, we didn't select them 0. We should have selected that person 1. We shouldn't select that person 0. If we did select the right person, we call that a hit. If we didn't select the wrong person, we call that a correct rejection. If we selected the wrong person, we call that a false alarm. And if we didn't select the right person, we call that a miss. And with this framework, that allows us to start charting things like our discriminability, right? And so when we plot our ROC curve, a straight line says we've got no discriminability. We can't tell a good candidate from a bad candidate. The selection criterion would ideally give us something that looks kind of like that, right? Such that we can get near perfect performance or a near perfect hit rate without many false alarms. Right? So false alarms would be charted along here. If you've got something that looks in between those, to make sure you're getting all the right candidates, you're going to have to accept a lot of false alarms as well, right? So this is one of the reasons companies like Google will give people short-term contracts, so like a 6-month contract, so they can say, okay, we're going to try to get all the right people in the door, but we're minimizing the cost if we have a false alarm, right? So we don't have to worry about severance packages or any of the issues therein associated. We can just end that contract at that time. Good. Any questions about what we covered last time? Awesome. All right, here's your fun fact of the day. Elvis Presley's manager sold I Hate Elvis badges as a way to make money off of people who weren't buying their merchandise. Look at that, that's conniving. All right, I'm not going to show this clip, but it's another office clip, although this one's from the British office. You don't really have to watch it, but I think it's funny. All right, so today we're talking about organizational design. We'll start by comparing and contrasting complexity and coupling. So complexity refers to the number of feedback loops, interconnected systems, and invisible, unexpected interactions. So this could be within a system, this could be within an organization. How many nodes and connections are there in that organization or in that system? Coupling refers to the degree to which two components have either a tight connection or a loose connection, right? So two components with a tight connection, varying one of those components could have substantial effects for other components. Right, so an example of a system with high coupling would be an aircraft, such that you get geese in the engine, its ability to fly is pretty severely hampered. And so again, we can think about these four systems themselves for technology, but also for organizations, right? You can have a complex organization. So is the ability for geese to fly. Yes, yeah. So I mean, there's tight coupling such that you clip a bird's wings, not going to be able to fly, right? There's not much redundancy in there that prevents that sort of tight coupling. So we're looking at organization. We're going to talk about three primary things: allocation of decision authority, patterns of interaction, and then distribution of information. And so that allocation of decision authority would be along that spectrum from a singular unitary leader to more of a peer-to-peer collaboration. Is it a collective decision, or is it a unilateral decision? Patterns of interaction, also along a continuum, ranging from strict hierarchy to more of a distributed network. And we'll talk about the US military in relation to this in a little bit here. And then regarding distribution of information, you get everything from tight control based off people's roles or their position to broad dissemination. Right, so at the control side of the spectrum, this is where you get classification of material. Right, so if you have a top secret clearance, that doesn't mean you can access all information at the top secret level. They usually have what's known as kind of a need to know basis. So you have to have the clearance, and then you also have to have a need to know. Right? They're trying to control that distribution of information to those who have the right to know it. To the other end, broad dissemination would be things like open source. All right, so I think I've talked about Comma AI, a competitor in the self-driving market. All of their software for self-driving is completely open source. Right? Their idea is, I'm going to put that information out there, and if you're able to build a better product off of our source code, great.
I have a question about your last example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the case of that company, if someone is able to develop a product using their source code, would then Common or the first company, would they be entitled to any finances, or are they entitled to any financial gains from the company that developed the better product? Would they
Nope.
would they be entitled to any of their what they gain from that?
No. So when you listen to, George Hotz is their was their CEO. I don't know what position he holds now, but he was a founder. And his idea is, look, I'm going to release this, and if you figure out a more creative way to go about, handling certain parameters in the data set, that presents us with the opportunity to better ourselves or to potentially acquire anybody who has this enhanced capability. Additionally, it creates an ecosystem that allows them to expand, right? So it's a plug and play. The idea is it's a plug and play system, but they don't fit every single make and model of car. And so by releasing it, they're now allowing their product to be acquired kind of through third-party vendors, because the third parties have taken the source code and manipulated it in a way that allows it to now work on your car if it wasn't something that Comma initially had put out there. It's a really interesting, so it's kind of very antithetical to a lot of the things that startup companies do, right, of closely guarding a lot of the secrets. I think that they have, they keep, I think, a lot of the hardware specs close to chest. So you can have access to the source code, but it has to have something to run on. And so I think that kind of protects them in a little aspect, but George Hotz is definitely somebody who's of the mindset that if you own something, that means you own it. He once got in trouble for, at least had pending lawsuits, because he was the first person to jailbreak the iPhone to make it such that you could put the iPhone on any cellular network. And I think at the time, AT&T was the only company that was allowed to sell iPhones. And so I think he had a major lawsuit against him from AT&T. And that kind of radically shaped his view about everything should be open source and open access. So I don't know if it's the best business decision, but that's their decision.
Okay, so in essence, he believes in the long run, his company in conjunction with, I guess, society will benefit better than
Yes,
some short-term profit.
exactly. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, by releasing that source code, they've had developers take the source code, like I said, apply it to new makes and models of cars. And now that company is able to now sell their product to people with those new makes and models of cars because the development community actually went out and made it. So there is potential upside for them. It is a much kind of more new age approach to business, but it's a really interesting company. I would definitely encourage you to just go look at it, if for nothing other than just kind of a case study. All right. So when talking about management structures, we can think about a hierarchical management structure or a flat management structure. So a hierarchical management structure is centralizing that decision authority. As we talked about information dissemination, it provides limitations on the interactions and information dissemination. And the benefits of a hierarchical management structure is it promotes efficient response to routine situations. Right? We know how we're supposed to act in this situation, and thus we can respond accordingly. And then you have the flat management structure, which is removing that centralization of the decision authority so that you're empowering workers at the lower levels to make more important management decisions. Right? So you'll sometimes hear this called decentralized command, especially in military settings. But I'm now making it such that you don't have to go all the way up the chain of command to get approval. You can make those decisions, at least in certain criteria, at the local level. And then you have network management. So organizing around teams of teams. All right, so you can think of this in a academic setting, right, where you would have teams of researchers working together, and then you can build up those teams from there, right? So I may have the team of my graduate researchers, and then we have the team of psychology research, which is bigger and encompassing. And then we have the team of College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences researchers, etc. And this is really the brilliance of the US military's structure. Right? We tend to think of the US military as being a very hierarchical structure, and in a way, it definitely is. But much of the idea behind the military's kind of operation is that you've got this hierarchical that lays out these big plans, and then the individual team leader or platoon leader, etc., is given that opportunity to execute to the best of their abilities as it fits within that overall stated objective. All right, this is one of the things that some historians actually credit as being the kind of one of the major advantages for the US forces in World War II is that in Germany, you had a very almost kind of aristocratic approach to leadership in the military, such that those with wealth, those with status were given leadership positions, and it was inappropriate for anybody to come back in and fill their position if they were killed. And so it would frequently be the case that they would have leadership be killed in the line of battle, and then would have to essentially sit by and wait for extra orders to come in from somebody who was qualified to provide those orders. Whereas in the US military, it was frequently the case that somebody would step up to fill that position as part of that hierarchical understanding, but having that decentralized command allows troops to act on their own when not in a position to actually interact with leadership. And so obviously, with us being social creatures, we're inherently susceptible to social norms. Right? I mean, think about all the overwhelming discussions of peer pressure when you're in high school, right? Just say no campaigns, things like that. And while it is true that teenagers tend to be more susceptible to social pressure, it certainly continues on throughout adulthood. And it's why the culture, right? We've talked about like cultures of safety before. We were talking about accidents, can have such a massive impact on the overall outcomes, accident rates, etc., in various industries. So you've made it such that part of what we're promoting is our safety. We care about safety. Everybody wears the hard hat, etc. I'm sure you all have had jobs where at some point during your onboarding process, you have somebody who's worked there for a little while say, we don't actually need to do that in response to some sort of standardized operating procedure, right? You don't really have to report that. Or, we don't really have to go through all these steps, etc. Right? That changes those kind of cultural norms. And I don't mean culture, large culture, I mean culture within the organization, which can affect people's willingness to adhere to other principles. And the social pressure also influences people's interactions in groups in kind of unique ways, right? And so one of the biggest threats to productivity, efficiency, and outcomes when dealing with groups is what we call groupthink. And it's where a group tends to reach consensus on something, even if the individual members would not have come to that same conclusion. Right? There is frequently an unstated pressure to conform to whatever that group pressure is. Whether you're cognizant of the fact or not, you're likely going to kind of silence any contrary views or contrary beliefs in order to maintain group harmony. And you can find all sorts of case studies on groupthink and all the issues inherent with it. One of the best case studies or examples that's out there is the Bay of Pigs invasion, right? Wherein the Kennedy administration decided that it was going to try and arm a group of rebels that would essentially storm the beaches in Cuba, and their presence would convince enough of the Cuban people to take up arms against the regime. But predictably, it was quashed pretty quickly on. And this is kind of touted as one of those classic examples of groupthink wherein you don't have anybody saying, okay, well, what happens if the 70 people, or whatever it was something comically small, that we arm are not able to get enough local support, right? What happens? Is there a better way of going about this? What happens if those ties can be made back to the US rather than what we're attempting to make it look like a natural insurgency? And so one way of dealing with this is what's called red teaming, wherein you are literally assigning a group of people to argue the other side. You're telling them what to believe and to go find information for that. So this is something that intelligence agencies try to apply often, wherein they get a group of people to say, okay, you're going to argue for whatever we're about to do, and then another group says you're going to argue against this, right? And so if you apply this to, for example, the bin Laden raid, you would have had a contingent of people saying, look at all the evidence that this person is probably Osama bin Laden, presenting all that evidence. And then you would have another team saying, look at all this evidence we have to suggest it's not bin Laden, right? And so it allows both sides to be argued in a way that prevents this kind of groupthink from dominating. So just kind of generally, teams tend to underperform initially as a function of establishing those group dynamics, right? That team building, even poor training, right? Will typically give people individual sources of information, but not great training about how to operate as a team. And it's why you can have great players go to new teams, but it takes a season or two for them to really get up to peak performance with training with those teams. Team building workshops should clarify the roles and responsibilities of team members, where it's not us just training generally, but we're saying this is your job in this organization, this is what you're responsible for, etc. Right, those types of directed workshops tend to be a lot better and more effective than workshops focusing on things like goal setting, problem solving, interpersonal communication, interpersonal relationships. It is astonishing how many workshops are put together which focus more on this, right? We're going to build the interpersonal relationships, which leads to people talking about their personal life, which has no bearing on the effectiveness of the team. Tell us what our confines are, what our field of play is. All right, so let's do a group critical thinking activity. So think back to teams you've been a part of. Was it a good team or a bad team to be a part of? What makes you say that? If it was good, why was it good? If it was bad, why was it bad? And what could have been done to make it better? So within what we've talked about so far, who can give me their own little case study?
So I think immediately of my senior design team in my undergraduate studies. It was me and three of my best friends in my engineering program. So we all got along really well. And I was kind of the type A personality in the group. So pretty quickly I became the organized one who sort of divided roles and responsibilities. And but then there were some one of the guys, for instance, was like really great at the business aspect that the three of us didn't have expertise in. So he was able to bring his strengths to the table for that. So I guess I say that to say we were able to divide up the responsibilities in a way that everyone got to work on what they were interested in, but it was also bringing like valuable input to the project. So I think that's like the best team experience I've ever had, because I would say generally when you're in the work environment, you're not working with your best friends, you're working with coworkers that you're kind of forced to work with. So you might not already have the compatibility aspects worked out.
Yeah. So yeah, you had a good kind of trust and good kind of interpersonal dynamics such that you didn't necessarily have to worry about the, that initial underperformance as a function of not necessarily knowing each other. But it also seems like y'all had a good kind of flat management structure where everybody was kind of put in charge of their own crap rather than running it through some sort of central decision maker. Yeah, that's great. Avery says, my previous boss was always putting the responsibility onto me, but I had no authority to act on what she was telling me. This led to an unbalanced team, and tensions were formed between all the employees. They, including myself, all left, and she was unable to maintain an employee longer than a few months. Had she had the backbone and used her authority, it would have meant less tension and more respect. Yeah, so you can create these kind of really weird team dynamics wherein you give somebody kind of marching orders, but not the authority to actually carry them out, right? And so what could have been done on the individual level, Avery? What do you think could have been done for perhaps you or any of the other employees to make that a better team environment? While we're waiting on her to type up her answer, does anybody have any other example? I tend to prefer this kind of more flat.
Froze.
Oh, that's okay. Yep. So did you hear my question? That's right. So yeah, so I tend to prefer that flat management style, right? Wherein it empowers the individuals to make those decisions rather than going up the entire chain of command, right? It can also be, no, I couldn't hear you, Avery, sorry, other than you saying your computer froze. Sorry. It seems to remove a lot of autonomy if you're forced into this very rigid hierarchical structure wherein you have to go and get approval for even the dumbest little things, right? People like to have the autonomy associated with making the decisions, at least as they are permitted to do so in the local environment. All right. So I give this lecture every year, but it's clearly a lot more relevant today in COVID times. Oops, Avery said, if everyone had a set responsibility, that would have taken out tensions and made it easier to see who was doing their jobs. Yes, yeah, so you make it explicit, you establish who's in charge of every individual subcomponent. Yep, that's great. So as we kind of move forward, I suspect you're going to see a lot of the changes we've made to adapt to COVID persist, right? So companies like Facebook have already said that they're allowing all their workers to work remotely until summer of 2021, frequently insinuating that they're going to give a lot of workers the opportunity to work remotely forever, right? There are obvious benefits associated with this. So Facebook has less of a footprint. They don't have to pay as much overhead. They allow workers to move wherever they want to. And so you don't have the restrictions of people saying, no, I don't want to work in the Bay Area and work remotely like that. But you can also think about all the different adaptations we've had in all the different adaptations we've had just to kind of deal with the educational environment. So things like Zoom or things like remote connecting robots allow people to interact in what is kind of a more personal way than just a unidirectional interaction wherein I'm recording something and providing it to you, or having kind of the inherently impersonable just phone calls, right? And so providing the opportunity to see others and interact with others allows for still some of the kind of traditional means of communication in business environments, while in this case maintaining safe practices. But it also is the case, especially now, where people in some cases are legally not allowed to get together and have to provide these same sort of business services remotely, have to go through with actual big decision-making processes using this technology, right? And so there are obvious benefits and obvious limitations to technologies like Zoom, right? If you don't know who Jeffrey Toobin is, just look for a news source on Jeffrey Toobin and Zoom. And there are obvious issues, all sorts of ways on that story. But you do get various benefits that aren't afforded by in-person interactions, right? And so having the opportunity to participate anonymously, right? You also have the opportunity to, even if you're not anonymous, still have a little bit of a social barrier between you and others that allows you to kind of speak against the group, right? And so if one of our biggest concerns is groupthink, having the opportunity to be away from others tends to provide us the opportunity to be a little bit more critical of others. See Twitter or Facebook. Also allows you to impose a much better structure on the process, right? A lot of meetings tend to get out of hand. It can be really hard to, for example, divide into groups that stay productive, but having something like Zoom that allows you to actually differentiate groups and force the hand there can be really useful. It's also nice that they frequently provide a workspace for kind of the decision-making, or excuse me, the idea generation process, also the decision-making process, in such a way that you have these kind of collaborative tools like, let's see if I can pull this up here. Actually, no, I don't want to share. Never mind. But like the whiteboard, right? So I can have the opportunity to pull up something and we can start sketching together in a way that allows me to present via different multimedia approaches, various ideas. Also allows us to reduce the counterproductive behavior, such as disapproval, right? One of my favorite things is when you get into a meeting and they have just decided that they're going to mute everybody in the meeting except for whoever they want to talk, which prevents people from deciding that their idea needs to be heard when frequently it doesn't need to be heard. It presents a much better opportunity to kind of cultivate a productive meeting environment rather than going off on these tangents. It also presents the opportunity to reduce that kind of perception of authority, right? I'm sure we've all been into groups wherein somebody clearly decides to, whether they mean to or not, kind of bully their way into the decision-making process. And so having this kind of distributed approach to decision-making and interactions allows for a little bit more of a careful cultivation of those interactions. So for groupware technology to support collaboration, from your book, the software must be more complex and elaborate than just basic communication and decision support systems, right? And so a lot of these collaborative softwares like Zoom, like Microsoft Teams, have enhanced capabilities that allow for collaboration in unique ways. There should be, I mean, this is still kind of an emerging line of interest for a lot of researchers, but adherence to a couple design principles, like including status overviews, right? So conveying some sort of high-level status summary to inform everybody about status condition and changes, right? So as information comes in, you want to make sure you're providing that internally as well as externally. And then providing some sort of ability to direct the people involved in that collaborative meeting to additional source of information. So direct team members to other information that'd be helpful or necessary, but's not currently displayed, right? And so having some sort of table of contents which allows people to access external information, right? One of the benefits of having a lot of these conferences via some sort of web platform rather than in person is when somebody says, you can go look up this article, somebody just posts the article, right? And so it makes it a lot easier to have access to those sources of information rather than the inherent limitations of in-person interactions. So you want to support that collaboration among team members by doing things like recording actions of different personnel, right? And so having the ability to record what people are saying, what people are talking about, promotes the retention of information in time, not just for an individual. Providing things like the whiteboards that Zoom offers, or space for collaborative problem solving, brainstorming. Right? One of the inherent limitations of doing everything online is you don't have a whiteboard where everybody can start to ballpark in a real physical whiteboard that everybody can add to have kind of that collective situation awareness. But by having those sorts of real physical objects presented into the virtual environment, you're able to kind of leverage the similar propensity to use such technologies. Also, it allows you to display the previous activity or highlights, right? So you can pull in previous information. I can save drawings, I can save recordings, I can save videos to bring them back for future use. And then when possible, support that coordination of team activities. So again, shared situation awareness about each person's goals, activities, information requirements, etc. And as we've all noticed, there are obvious downsides of using technology. Right? One of the biggest ones, at least I've experienced, is kind of this blurring of work-life boundary. Right? When every meeting takes place on your computer, it's kind of hard to say, no, I'm not available at that time, or I'll already be home at that time, or things like that. You also lose the benefit of kind of these spontaneous interpersonal interactions. Right? So some of the best and most productive meetings I had in graduate school and in my postdoc were kind of these spontaneous, somebody walks by with an idea, and then you launch into kind of a 2-hour brainstorming session. Is this screen shaking? The projection, do y'all see that? It's annoying. All right. Yeah, so this happens in science too, right? So it's not just in kind of more traditional work environments. Papers co-authored by people in the same building were cited 45% more often, right? So you can think about some of the causes that may result in that. Things like having these kind of in-depth conversations allows for kind of much more meaningful theoretical contributions. It avoids any of the issues associated with long delays and waiting for collaborators across the country or across the world to get meaningful or important analyses back to you, etc. Right? And so having those casual and spontaneous encounters are not only good for people's mental health, but also good for their productivity. You also get this effect wherein, having collaborators across the world leads to some interesting time constraints for phone calls. Right? And so my uncle currently works in Hong Kong, and one of the things he's obviously always concerned about, so he's a financial analyst, one of the things he's always concerned about is the markets here in the US, right? And because Hong Kong is about 12 hours asynchronous with the US, he's got to be up stupidly early in the morning in Hong Kong to make sure that any of the indicators from the US market from the day before are addressed in their sort of financial trades. It also, in addition to kind of that work-life boundary being blurred, also blurs the lines between kind of work and vacation. So as an example, 2 summers ago, I went out backpacking around Lake Tahoe and got about 15 miles in on our first day backpacking, and I still had LTE service on my phone, which allowed me to check work emails, which was horrendously stupid. I shouldn't do it. But, I mean, I'm sure you all have this experience wherein, perhaps the last thing you do before you go to bed is check your email. The first thing you do when you wake up is check your email. There's never a moment wherein you don't have access to all of this pertinent information. It also leads to feelings of guilt, right? When you get emails at 8 p.m. from your advisor, you feel like, okay, well, now I've got to respond to it because I've seen it and they're sending emails at 8 p.m. It doesn't allow you to say, okay, well, I'll just deal with it when I get into the office in the next morning. It's great for people to have that differentiation, but it's not always obtainable. All right, so as with last time with that checkout station extra credit opportunity, I'm giving you another extra credit opportunity if you want it. The next big startup, Tenenfeld Industries, has come to you and asked for help designing their workspace. They employ people around the globe, but have a massive workforce right here in Huntsville. Draw a mock-up design for the workspace and draw a mock-up for the groupware software. All right, I think one of the really neat things about this pandemic is it has opened the possibility for the next great idea of kind of revolutionizing the work environment. I mean, you look at Zoom's stock prices from before the pandemic to after the pandemic hit, and they skyrocketed in such a way that they weren't actually prepared to handle the growth that they experienced. And there were some big learning curves early on, right? But this presents a really neat opportunity for you to think about, okay, what are some of the inefficiencies in the current approaches of the current systems? And what are things I, as the individual, could do to actually create some sort of change, right? And so if this spurs any brilliant ideas from which you make your billions, I will take a cool 15% and leave you alone. So, all right. So before we call it quits for today, what was some of the main takeaways from today's lecture?
Technology is really helpful in the workplace, but it also is difficult, adds extra difficulties.
Yeah. So the last little bit, the technology was essentially just slides of your experience since March, right? There are benefits and there are costs associated with it.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So peer pressure is very important, and in some ways it relates back to last class when we were talking about personnel choices, because you have to make sure that you're choosing good personnel to foster the environment that you want that's achieving your goals.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so making sure you have that right personality coming in who, may not be the best engineer, but has the right attitude to maintain that kind of culture of safety and, culture that promotes great interpersonal interactions, etc. Yes, exactly. One other thing.
Don't be Jeffrey Toobin.
Don't be Jeffrey Toobin. Yes. What a way to end the semester. Yes. Yeah, when you can have your name turn into a verb, you know you've done something wrong. So, awesome. All right. On Tuesday, again, we're going to have Marlon talk to us over Zoom. So everybody log on to this, no in-person contingent. Thursday, we will do the final exam review. So come with specific questions, and I'll be happy to answer those. And then we will have Thanksgiving. So have a good one.
I may have missed it. When did you say this extra credit was? When did you want it by?
It didn't say, let's say by the end of next week.
Yeah, that works. Okay, thank you. Bye.